Well, if this morning has taught us anything, it's taught us that St. Mary Magdalene will triumph over everything. I trust that everyone is well rested with an extra hour of sleep. Maybe? Our clocks have changed. Our calendar has turned the page to November. The feast of Christ the King, with its apocalyptic overtones, looms in our near future. We are in the Advent of Advent. But let's not mention Christmas yet. Speaking of apocalyptic overtones, in less than 48 hours, our nation will go to the polls to determine the next chapter in the story of our country. We find ourselves in the midst of a season, a kairos, during much more than our clocks and calendars will change. Kairos, as many of you know, is the Greek word for season or special time. How shall we negotiate this kairos of new and conflicting stories, often fraught with anxiety, but sometimes filled with hope? Speaking of anxiety, how is it that the political ads become worse every cycle? I think I've developed carpal tunnel syndrome from repeatedly hitting the mute button on my remote. But the sad answer is negative, hateful ads work. Long before the election of 2016, even before the explosion of talk radio and cable news, humanity has had to confront a story that told us something unpleasant about ourselves. Appeals to our worst instincts by demagogues often leave our social fabric in tatters. As the comic strip Pogo observed in the middle of the last century, we have met the enemy and he is us. We cannot deny this story. It is not about them, it's about us. But even though that story may be true, it's the wrong story to tell. Just as we have to change the clock and change the calendar, we also have to change the story. Instead of denying, blame shifting, or deflecting the awful truth, we have to find better stories, the right stories to tell. Last Sunday, Kathy and Terry and Anne Marie helped us find better stories that also told us something about ourselves. I can only imagine and admire the courage and resilience of Anne Marie. For those of you who did not hear her story, she is the residential coordinator at Dawn's Place, a home, I think that's the right word for it, a home that offers a safe and supporting harbor for survivors of sex trafficking. As a survivor herself, Anne Marie has overcome some of the most difficult, oppressive set of obstacles a woman could experience. I know I'm not that strong or that faithful, but I was strengthened in faith, hope, and encouraged by her example. Last week, with Kathy's homily and Anne Marie's autobiography, we were reminded that this kairos of all saints and all souls is precisely the time to remember and reclaim those stories that tell us about our better selves. That's where today's first reading has relevance. And again, Chantal, I'm sorry I did that to you. It speaks of events that happened in 1949, but which had not become a story for 40 years. Norman Maclean was born in Iowa in 1902, the older son of a Scotch Presbyterian minister. Soon thereafter, his family moved to Missoula, Montana, where he grew up. He volunteered for the U.S. Forest Service at the age of 14. At 18, he boarded a train that would take him to college at Dartmouth, after which he secured a position teaching Shakespeare at the University of Chicago. But he often returned to Montana. Given his own experiences in the woods, he was especially drawn to the memory of what was then the worst tragedy in the history of the U.S. Forest Service. In 1949, 17 elite firefighters, known as smoke jumpers, parachuted into Mann, Gulch, Montana to tame a wildfire. However, not long thereafter, they were caught in a sudden confluence of swirling winds and exploding fire. 14 of them died running uphill, trying to escape for their lives. and trying to escape the Gulch. In his 80s, Maclean visited and revisited the daunting terrain of Mann Gulch to do his research in an effort to tell their story. It was that important to him about what it was also telling him about himself. The book became his unfinished symphony when he died in 1989. His son John finished editing his papers to publish Young Men and Fire posthumously in 1992. Norman Maclean needed to tell that story because he understood that grace could come from tragedy. For him, the 14 young men who died represented humanity at its best. He was compelled to create that story for the same reason that 10 days from now, on November 16th, we will remember the martyrdom of the 6 Salvadoran Jesuits, their housekeeper and her daughter. The Jesuits were pastors and university professors. They were murdered in their sleep in 1989 by members of the Salvadoran military. They were killed for the same reason Jesus was crucified. They worked militantly but non-violently to breach the systemic social barriers that marginalized and oppressed the poor. The strength, service, and courage of the Jesuits tells us the right story about the church. The strength, service, and courage of the smoke jumpers told Norman Maclean the right story about human nature. And as Kathy said so well last week, here's the deep mystery of stories. Retelling these stories of our blessed dead reunites us to them. We are literally remembered to them, and they to us. Hearing and retelling their stories redeems us. And our telling of their stories also redeems them. After all, the communion of saints is powered by mutuality and interdependence upon one another, both living and dead. The author of Luke's gospel understood this well. During the generations before Luke wrote both the gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, the earliest followers of Jesus were fueled by an apocalyptic hope that Jesus would return imminently to save them from the social structures that oppressed, persecuted, and killed them. As the risen Son of Man, the Christ would return to save them by exerting the power of God's kingdom into and over history. But like Norman Maclean, Luke was writing long after the events that he was now fashioning into a new story. More than 50 years had passed, but the Son of Man had not decisively put it into human history with apocalyptic power. For Luke, faith in the power of the kingdom required a metanoia, a fundamental change in one's understanding of that power, a change of mind about what the power of the kingdom was. So Luke told a different story than his 2 predecessors, Mark and Matthew. He introduced his audience to a rich set of characters. Only in Luke do we meet Zechariah, Elizabeth, Simeon, Anna, Zacchaeus, and the repentant thief crucified alongside of Jesus. Most notably, for the first time in the gospel tradition, Mary, the mother of Jesus, actually gets to speak. Luke also gave us the story of the 2 pilgrims on the road to Emmaus who recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Rather than placing his hopes on an imminent apocalypse, Luke compelled his audience to focus on the power of the kingdom that manifested itself among them, wherever and whenever they gathered to share the right stories and break the bread. Last week in her homily, Kathy did what Luke did. She told the right story, one that reflected how the power of the kingdom is incarnated among us. As Luke did, she named names to provide examples. You know who you are. With Terry's help, we experienced the power of the kingdom among us as Anne-Marie told her story. In this season, fraught with anxiety, there's no need to look afar for signs and wonders. Every week that we gather, right here, the power of the kingdom is among us. And no political election, no power on earth could ever change that. Amen.